Good?
Okay, thanks.
You got a lot going on there, man.
I know.
Look, we're here in Philadelphia to highlight the Americans who have suffered under Kamala Harris's policies, especially Kamala Harris's border policies. To remind you, she, on day one, suspended deportations, proposed mass amnesty for millions of illegal aliens. She stopped construction of the border wall, and she stopped the Remain in Mexico policy that had kept a lot of Americans safe. Now, today we're going to talk to a lot of Americans who have suffered and had children and loved ones who have died because of these border policies. It has led to record fentanyl overdoses in our country. It's led to a lot of migrant crime from people who shouldn't even be here. And it's, of course, driven up the price of housing for a lot of Americans who shouldn't have to compete with 20 million illegal aliens for scarce homes. Obviously, the big news of the day is that Tim Walz has been nominated as the VP, or is now the presumptive nominee, I should say, for Kamala Harris. My view on it is it just highlights how radical Kamala Harris is. This is a person who listened to the Hamas wing of her own party and selecting a nominee. This is a guy who's proposed shipping more manufacturing jobs to China, who wants to make the American people more reliant on garbage energy instead of good American energy, and has proposed defunding the police just as Kamala Harris does. I think it's interesting, actually. They make an interesting tag team because, of course, Tim Walz allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis in the summer of 2020, and then the few who got caught, Kamala Harris helped bail them out of jail. So it is more instructive for what it says about Kamala Harris, that she doesn't care about the border, she doesn't care about crime, she doesn't care about American energy, and most importantly, she doesn't care about the Americans who have been made to suffer under those policies. I'll take a couple questions, then we're going to hit the road and go to this press conference. Yeah.
Would show that it's anti-Semitism. Reason why you believe Kamala Harris didn't choose Josh Shapiro instead of that?
Well, it's not what I believe. It's what the Democratic leadership has said. Many people said repeatedly that the reason Kamala Harris was going away from the Josh Shapiro selection is because they were worried about anti-Semitism. They were worried about certain voters. They were worried about some of the leaders and the grassroots activists in their party wouldn't take a Jewish nominee. I think it's despicable. I think it's disgusting, but that is right out of the words of many members of the Democratic leadership. And so now we have Tim Walz, but again, most importantly, we have Kamala Harris. Her policies have been a disaster, and they will remain so if the American people give her promotion.
Senator,
Yeah.
Senator, have you or Governor Walz reached out to one another? I know when you're going to be. You guys have reached out.
I actually, on the way to the flight in Cincinnati, I guess in northern Kentucky, I actually called Tim Walz. I left a voicemail. I didn't get him, but I just said, look, congratulations. Look forward to a robust conversation and enjoy the ride. And maybe he'll call me back. Maybe he won't. Yeah.
Senator, excuse me.
Yeah.
The Governor and Vice President Harris are expected to take a battleground state tour in the next couple of days.
Sure.
Former President Trump won't be making a public campaign appearance until Friday in Montana. Is that a missed opportunity?
No, look, I think I'm making a number of public appearances over the next few days just to drive home the fact that Kamala Harris's policy have been such a failure for normal Americans. I know the president's very busy over the next few days. One of the things you've got to do is, of course, get out there and speak to people and speak to reporters. A final thing that you have to do, of course, is raise the resources, and I know the president's very busy doing exactly that. So he and I are taking a divide and conquer strategy to this campaign. Sometimes we obviously do events together, but I think we're going to use the fact that we have two people who can both get out there and prosecute a message. We're going to hit the road, but I want to make just one final observation. I know most of you. I like all of you as people, or at least I like the ones of you that I know. I think that you guys have got to do a better job at actually forcing Kamala Harris to answer questions. This is a person who's been the presumptive Democrat nominee for 16 days. She hasn't taken a single real question from a reporter. The American people deserve to get to know the people who want to lead them, and I think it's shameful for Kamala Harris, but increasingly for the media, that she's taking a basement strategy of running from reporters instead of getting in front of them, answering tough questions about her record, and letting the American people know who she is. President Trump and I take hostile questions, we take non-hostile questions, we get out there and talk to people because we respect the American people enough to want to persuade them and not to try to run from them. So I think you guys got to do a better job. That's my humble opinion. Take it easy, guys. Thank you.
Come on, let's go. Let's go. Sorry. Do you need me to grab?
Yeah, please.
Ma'am.
To congratulate him to say he was along for the ride after he was chosen as Vice President Harris.
Could you repeat the beginning of that? I missed the first.
Earlier today, you said that you called Governor Walz, so clearly at least part of you believes that he could be the vice presidential candidate. Are you saying that you will not debate him, or will you agree to go on the debate stage with Tim Walz?
No, I absolutely want to debate Tim Walz, but I want to debate him actually after he's actually officially the nominee. And I did call him and congratulate him and offered him my best wishes. I think that's the polite thing to do. But look, would it shock me if the Democrats pulled another switcheroo? No, it wouldn't. So look, we're going to wait until they actually nominate Kamala Harris and Tim Walz before we do any debates. And then, of course, we want to have a robust debate again because we believe the American people have the right to have their political leaders try to persuade them. And that is what's so scandalous about Kamala Harris's basement campaign. 16 days she has been the presumptive nominee of the Democrat Party. 0 times she has sat for a real media interview. That's a disgrace. Nobody should ask to lead the American people unless she's willing to answer tough questions. And if she's too afraid of the American media, how is she possibly going to deal with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and a bunch of world leaders all over the globe? You all, and I'm especially grateful to the folks behind me for offering testimony so people can understand what the consequences are of failed leadership. God bless you all and thank you. All right. Calm down. We've got to give the fake news a few questions here. Though I'm sure we have hopefully a few honest journalists here in the audience. Ma'am. So first of all, the reason I didn't say a whole lot about Tim Walz is because the Democrats have showed a willingness to pull a little switcheroo on us. So I don't even know if we're actually going to get Tim Walz out of this campaign. And I think that a lot of us are asking ourselves, well, it's not going to be official until the Democrats actually nominate him, I guess, at their convention next week. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, look, Tim Walz's record is a joke. He's been one of the most far-left radicals in the entire United States government at any level. But I think that what Tim Walz's selection says is that Kamala Harris has bent the knee to the far left of her party, which is what she always does. Kamala Harris listened to the Hamas wing of the party. She selected Tim Walz, a guy who wants to ship more manufacturing jobs to China, who wants to give illegal aliens driver's license, and who wants to make the fentanyl crisis that we just heard about so much worse because he refuses to do his job and actually make it easier for American citizens and not illegal aliens to live a good life. So I think what it says is that Kamala Harris is running as a San Francisco liberal. She is governed as a San Francisco liberal, and she's chosen a running mate who will be a San Francisco-style liberal. The last thing that I'll say about Tim Walz is, to her credit, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz do make an interesting team, because if we remember the rioting in the summer of 2020, Tim Walz was the guy who let rioters burn down Minneapolis, and then Kamala Harris was the one who bailed the rioters out of jail. So there's an interesting team in that sense. Sir. Well, if you build a 100-foot wall, you're going to have a lot fewer illegal aliens coming into this country, and it's obvious, and it worked when Donald Trump was president. Look, no one has ever said a wall keeps out 100% of illegal aliens, but if it keeps out 98%, I'd say we're doing pretty good. And that means less fentanyl, less drugs, and less crime coming into our communities. So I was at the border just a few days ago. It's a lot hotter down there in South Arizona than it is here in Philadelphia. And I remember seeing the slats of border wall just sitting on the ground. And why are they sitting on the ground instead of being constructed? Because Kamala Harris said you're not allowed to construct border wall anymore. That means more fentanyl in South Philly. That means more orphan children. That means more suffering Americans, and we can't let Kamala Harris forget it. Ma'am. And I'll take just a couple more here, and then we got to hit the road. Thank you all.
Senator, do you think any similarities with Walz in your both from the Midwest, and you work for the...
Can you start that again?
Yeah, do you think you have any similarities? And you can talk about like common ground that you share with Walz.
Well, look, I mean, yeah, we're white guys from the Midwest. I guess there are similarities there. But what's different is the actual ideas about how best to serve people, white, black, or anything else, in the Midwest and everywhere else, right? I can't believe this is a guy who tries to claim that he stands for working people, and yet he wants to pursue energy policies that are going to ship everybody's job to China. In some ways, what Tim Walz represents is doubling down on failed 30 years of leadership in this country where we don't make enough of our own stuff. We don't use enough of our own workers to make enough of our own stuff. We rely on everybody else for energy instead of American citizens, and then we throw open the southern border to make our communities less livable and less safe. He is the double down choice for failed leadership, and again, Kamala Harris selected him. I don't know why, but I think it's because she's fundamentally a radical herself and she wanted a partner in crime. Ma'am.
Can we talk a bit about foreign policy?
Yeah, sorry.
Let's talk a little bit about...
Sir.
Last night, Governor Walz suggested that because of your Ivy League education and your Silicon backing your political career, that you yourself are part of the elite. What are your first impressions of them trying to frame you this way to the American public?
Well, look, I came from a family where nobody in my family had ever gone to law school. I grew up in a poor family. The fact that Tim Walz wants to turn it into a bad thing, that I actually worked myself through college, through law school, and made something myself, to me, that's the American dream. And if Tim Walz wants to insult it, I think that's frankly pretty bizarre. Now, look, what really bothers me about Tim Walz, it's not even the positions that he's taken, though certainly he has been a far-left radical. You know what really bothers me about Tim Walz as a Marine who served his country in uniform? When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful to prepare your unit to go to Iraq, to make a promise that you're going to follow through, and then to drop out right before you actually have to go. I also think it's dishonest. Something, again, if you guys ever get an opportunity to ask Tim Walz or Kamala Harris some questions, he made this interesting comment that the Kamala Harris campaign put out there, and I bet they're regretting they put it out there now, because he said that and he was making a point about gun control, he said we shouldn't allow weapons that I used in war to be on America's streets. Well, I wonder, Tim Walz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone? What bothers me about Tim Walz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not. And if he wants to criticize me for getting an Ivy League education, I'm proud of the fact that my mamaw supported me, that I was able to make something of myself. I'd be ashamed if I was him and I lied about my military service like he did. Sir. Could you speak a little louder? Sorry.
An ABJ conference. He was asked whether you'd be ready to assume the presidency on day one, and he responded by talking about how the vice president pick doesn't really impact the election outcome.
Sure.
Was that the response that you were hoping for from the former president?
Well, what the president has said, and I agree with him, is that most people are voting at the top of the ticket. Now, Tim Walz is a crazy radical, of course. He allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis, but most people are going to be voting for Kamala Harris or for Donald Trump. I think it was a common sense observation. He said it before I was the pick. He said it after I was the pick, and I think he's absolutely right. Now, I will say that on the vice presidential issue, it's interesting what Tim Walz says about Kamala Harris. Tim Walz is a person, again, who promoted rioters burning down the biggest city in his state. This is a guy who wants to give driver's licenses to illegal aliens. This is a guy who wants to take children away from their parents if those parents don't consent to sex changes for minors. This is a radical human being who comes from the far left wing of the Democrat Party. And what Kamala Harris is telling all of us by selecting Tim Walz is that she bends the knee to the far left of the Democrat Party. She's done it every single time in government. She's done it in who she selected as her VP nominee, and she will do it if the American people give her a promotion to President of the United States. We don't have to guess at what Kamala Harris believes. The fact that she keeps on leaning on the most far left people in the Democrat Party tells us exactly who she is and what she stands for.
I just want to ask about your accusations this morning about Walz, about the abandoning his fellow soldiers.
Yeah.
Are you basing that on anything more than a Facebook post? And how do you feel about? I mean, these are, as you know, serious accusations.
Sure.
As well, like, I mean, your running mate has faced similar accusations about avoiding service because of bone spurs. Do you think that is accurate and fair to for Trump to face?
Well, look, the difference, Mike, between what President Trump has said and done and what Walz has said and done is that President Trump didn't lie, right? President Trump did not serve in the United States military. He's never claimed that he did. Walz did say on camera that I carried a gun in a war. Well, which war did you carry a gun in? Because you apparently never went to a war zone. That is a totally reasonable question to ask. And I think the evidence at this point is overwhelming that he lied about serving in a combat zone. By the way, I served in a combat zone. I answered the call. I've never lied about my military service. He clearly has. There was another quote I actually just saw a couple of hours ago where he apparently said that he fought in Iraq, or at least a journalist reported that he said he fought in Iraq. Well, if he said that, that is a lie, and we have to be willing to call people out. Lying about your military service in order to procure political points, that's really disgraceful conduct. It's a slap in the face to millions of American veterans, and I think it's totally reasonable to call them out on it.
You fought in Iraq?
I served in a combat zone. I never said that I saw a firefight myself, but I've always told the truth about my Marine Corps service. That's the difference between me and Tim Walz.
I just want to make sure you have not seen a firefight.
Thank you, guys.
Any more local PA? Ma'am.
Olivia Gloucester, WTHA News. And speaking with a lot of the veterans in our community, one thing that they tell us is that they are working in minimum wage jobs because they want to get their education on the battlefield instead of in a college. How do you plan to address the minimum wage in this country to help avoid wage disparity?
So it's a great question. I think that, again, the best way to promote rising wages among all of our citizens, veteran or not, is we've got to have labor markets that are tight. And one of the reasons why we have so many people scraping by on minimum wage jobs is that Kamala Harris has let in 20 million illegal aliens to undercut the wages of American workers. Get them out of here and give a pay raise to American citizens, not to illegal aliens. But I want to address something, because he touched on something that's really important, which is the education component of this. And as all of us know, I mean, look, I joined right out of high school, and I went to college afterwards, but we have served with a lot of very smart master sergeants and first sergeants and sergeant majors and command sergeant majors. Not Tim Walz, of course. He's not really a command sergeant major. He just pretends to be one on TV. But real people who do not have a college degree and have more real-world experience and more real-world education than anybody who got a four-year, degree in basket weaving from a university. So we actually, I think, need to make it easier for veterans, and President Trump and I have plans to do exactly this, for the education that veterans get on the battlefield in their training to translate to the job market on the civilian world. And we do that. And I think that, one, we stop discriminating against people who didn't go to college, but we actually promote the skills formation, skills recognition in our veterans. That'll help raise their wages more than almost any government program.
News that you've agreed to a debate on October 1st, and you're calling for additional debates. Can you explain what do you hope to get out of those additional debates?
Well, it's not really what I hope to get out of these additional debates. It's what the American people deserve to get out of seeing the people who want to be their vice president actually debate. I just, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but as the person who's asking the American people for the awesome honor and responsibility of being their vice president, I think I would have to go before the American people and make the case for why I deserve to have that job. And I think it's disgraceful that Tim Walz and Kamala Harris are running from every media interview, running from every reporter. They refuse to respect the American people enough to stand before them and actually ask them for their vote. So I think we ought to do as many debates as we possibly can. I know the President Trump has invited Kamala Harris to do 3 debates. She's only agreed to 1. Tim Walz, I guess we agreed to do a debate on October 1st, but CNN, not exactly friendly to me, much more left-wing than almost any other media station. CNN wants to do a debate in mid-September. And I said, yes, absolutely, because the American people deserve it. And Just one final point about this. Look, the Harris campaign is not running a political campaign. They're trying to produce a movie. She never stands before the American people without a script. She never talks to voters unless a teleprompter is right in the middle of them. This is not a person who we should trust to sit in a private room with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and the leaders of America's, whether they're adversaries or friends. If you are afraid of a friendly media, and the media has been very friendly to Kamala Harris, then how can we possibly trust you to represent us on the world stage? The answer is we can't, which is why we ought to fire Kamala Harris, not give her a promotion.
Thank you, Senator Vance.
Sorry.
It's okay. A new ABC Ipsos poll was out today. It shows that Governor Walz, Vice President Harris's running mate, has a higher favorability among Americans than you do. What's your response to that poll? And also, what can you do ahead of the October debate to try to win over more Americans and your campaign?
Well, look, I don't put much stock in polls, especially at this early level. I think Governor Walz was nominated just a couple of weeks ago. He's received a ridiculous media honeymoon where they've hidden, a lot of press have hidden some of the things that he said and done. I mean, this is a guy who actively encouraged rioters to burn down Minneapolis during the summer of 2020. It's the biggest city in his country. And then, of course, his running mate, Kamala Harris, was offering to bail those rioters out of prison. I think when people know the truth about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, their anti-crime record, their pro-criminal record, the fact that he let rioters burn down the largest city in Minneapolis, I don't think his approval ratings are going to be that high, and I think that Donald Trump and I are going to win this race. But that's what the campaign is about, right? We have a little bit less than 90 days to make our case to the American people, to persuade them that our policies are going to make their lives better. And again, I think you contrast the failed leadership of Kamala Harris with the peace and prosperity of Donald Trump. I don't think there's any doubt we're going to win this race, but we've got to run the campaign, and we've got to get out there and talk to people. That's what we're doing every single day. Maybe do one more. Any other Wisconsin people? Tough questions. I don't think that's too much to ask, is it? Now, speaking of, she has got quite the running mate, this guy, Tim Walz, who... Tim Walz, I swear, before the end of the campaign, Tim Walz is going to be talking about how he was carrying an M16 through the jungles of Vietnam. But this guy, everything that comes out of his mouth about his military service is at least 25% a lie. And, you know, it occurred to me, the closest Tim Walz has ever come to combat, even though he says he carried a weapon in war, the closest Tim Walz has ever come to combat is when he let rioters burn Minneapolis to the ground a few years ago, right? But he acts like such a tough guy, my friends. I don't know if you saw this, but Tim Walz said that he would debate me anytime, anywhere. So he threw out October 1st, a debate moderated by CBS, which I'm sure is going to be in the tank for the Democrats, but who cares? Because I respect the American people to go before hostile media. But when he says he'll debate anytime, anywhere, he apparently didn't mean in mid-September, because I offered him a debate in front of CNN, not exactly friends of me and Donald Trump. And you know what Tim Walz said? No thanks. Because they are hiding from the American people. My message to Kamala and Tim Walz, but especially to the American people, is the American people deserve to be led by somebody who is willing to get out there and talk to people. Kamala and Tim, stop hiding in the basement, get out there and campaign. We'd all appreciate it quite a bit.
Hi, Senator. Kit Maher, CNN. I know Donald Trump has been reported. She's one of the good CNN reporters. There's like two of them. She's okay. Back to my question. So Donald Trump has enlisted the help of Tulsi Gabbard to prep for his debate. I'd like to know how you were prepping for a debate with Tim Walz, who has described himself as a bad debater. Who's helping you, and how are you prepping?
Well, I found a good friend from back home who embellishes and lies a lot, and I'm having him stand in for Tim Walz. That's what we're doing during our debate. But look, all kidding aside, what we're going to do is we're going to focus a lot on policy, right? The way that I'm trying to prepare is to try to make sure that we're prepared to answer the American people's questions on how we're going to make their lives better, how we're going to make their communities safer, how we're going to bring back prosperity and low prices to the American economy. And we're going to focus on policy. And then obviously we're going to answer whatever questions the moderators have. That's how we're focusing. And by the way, just on President Trump, we have to remember Tulsi Gabbard was a Democratic congresswoman just a few years ago. She ran against Kamala Harris back in 2020, and now she is firmly behind the Trump-Vance ticket. We're actually the ticket that is supported by common sense people across the spectrum. I think Tulsi Gabbard, you saw her, I mean, she basically ended Kamala's campaign on the debate stage, so she's a hell of a debater, but she's also one of these people who believes in some common sense things like we shouldn't send America's sons and daughters off to fight in stupid wars, right? Amen to that, Tulsi. And I think it's really telling that the campaign that has brought a lot of Democrats and Republicans and independents together, it's the campaign of Donald J. Trump, and that's very important. We'll do one more question.
And, sir, so Tim Walz is getting heat for previously saying that he and his wife use IVF to start their family.
Sorry, please repeat that.
Yeah, no, you're good. Sorry. Governor Tim Walz is getting heat for previously saying that him and his wife use IVF to start their family when he actually used IUI. You know, you have attacked him for not being clear about his military record. Do you think this is becoming a pattern, him using ambiguous language, either through commission or omission, talking about, you know, his record?
Yeah, I do that. I mean, look, I saw that this morning, and it's just such a bizarre thing to lie about, right? There's nothing wrong with having a baby through IVF or not having a baby through IVF. Like, why lie about it? I just don't understand that. And having, had people who, friends of mine who used IUI, and then some of them worked out and some of them didn't, and then some of the people who didn't work out, they then used IVF. Like, you know the difference, right? Anybody who's had a friend or themselves gone through fertility treatments, you know the difference, so why lie about it? I just don't understand it. My basic read on Tim Walz, and I don't know the guy, but my basic read, if you look at his military record, the lies about the rank, the lies about serving in combat, the lies now about IVF, even lying about, like, his food preferences, my read on him is that he's a guy who likes to just barely cross the line, right? And I think most of us have met people who just like to embellish a little bit up to the line, and then they cross the line, and I think that's clearly what Tim Walz is. So I wouldn't be surprised if over the next, 3 months of the campaign, 2.5 months of the campaign, we find another 15 random bizarre things that he lied about. He just clearly likes to do it. I don't understand why, but it seems to be a little pathological. She wants to represent America all over the world, but she's terrified to face a friendly media. Does anyone think that the person who runs from the friendly American press could stand up to Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping? Of course you couldn't. So if you believe that a strong America requires a strong leader, I've got a recommendation for you. Why don't we re-elect President Donald J. Trump? And while we're on the topic, don't send her stolen valor sidekick. Send a former Marine. Send JD Vance to be vice president. We got some Marines out there. Semper Fi. Now, Kamala Harris, she gets really mad when I bring up the stolen valor of her running mate. But let me tell you why it matters. Every single person here understands why this matters. Here's the record on Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota. He dropped out of the military and allowed his unit to go to Iraq without him. And he knew they were going to Iraq. He lied about it, but he knew they were going to Iraq. Even his chaplain called him a coward. And those of you who served in the military know the chaplain is the nicest person in the unit. If the chaplain is calling you a coward, you must have really screwed up. He claimed to carry a weapon in war, but you ask him, Tim, what war have you ever been in? And the answer is he's never been to a single war. He lied about it. He lied about his rank, and he stood in silence as Nancy Pelosi and a lot of journalists praised him for his service on an imaginary battlefield instead of correcting the record. What won't stolen valor Tim Walz fib about? In fact, I believe at his next speech, he's probably going to say he survived an assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. I think that's what Tim Walz is going to claim next time. Now look, we don't criticize, and this is where the media is dishonest here, we don't criticize Tim Walz for his years of service in the National Guard. We condemn him for lying about that service for political gain. It's disgraceful, and nobody should tolerate it. Now, Tim Walz needs to not only explain why he abandoned his Guard unit, he also needs to explain his bizarre love affair with China. Have you seen this? This guy's been to China more than the U.S. ambassador to China. He got married in China. He visited China over 30 times. He honeymooned in China. He taught a course approved by the Communist Party in China. He even brought American high school students with him on visits to China. Now I know, and we all know, that Kamala Harris wanted to outsource our factories and jobs to China, but I didn't expect her to outsource the selection of her running mate to China too. But here's the problem in choosing him for vice president. It's not just about Tim Walz, it's about Kamala Harris's terrible judgment. We do not need a president with terrible judgment. We need Donald J. Trump back in the White House.
Wow. Well, let's let our sheriffs get up here. I'm proud to be flanked by a number of great law enforcement leaders in the state of Georgia, because we're here today to celebrate law enforcement and to celebrate a president who has stood with law enforcement, and that's Donald J. Trump. Now, we ought to remember here that we have the best country in the world. We got the best workers in the world. We've got the best people in the world. We've got the most beautiful and most abundant natural resources in the world. But the one thing that we have got to do to fix this country is fix the leadership. Because as much as we've got incredible blessing and incredible bounty, we have got a screwed up vice president calling the shots. And I think it's time to fire Kamala Harris, not to give her a promotion. Now, I don't know if you saw yesterday, but her VP nominee, Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, gave a little speech at the Democratic National Convention. I will say I appreciate the Democrats not being able to keep anything on time, because I think by the time that he spoke, everybody in the state of Georgia was already in bed. And if you weren't asleep at the beginning of the speech, you were sure as hell asleep by the end of the speech. Ain't that right? But look, it's interesting that they are running, trying to pretend to be tough on crime people. Kamala Harris says that she's now tough on crime. She's got religion. She found Jesus about being tough on crime, and she found it about a month ago when Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race. Because the record of Kamala Harris and the record of her running mate is doing everything they can to make the lives of our law enforcement harder, to make it harder for them to keep our communities safe. Kamala Harris was the prosecutor in San Francisco, California. And if you think San Francisco, California has been well run from a tough on crime perspective, then I've got another thing to tell you. One of the most, by the way, a beautiful city, San Francisco, California, has been destroyed by the leadership of people like Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris wants to take San Francisco liberalism nationwide, and I think we are not going to let her. Georgia is not going to let her, and it starts right here in Austin. Now let's just run through the contrast a little bit, the difference between Kamala Harris's record on law enforcement and Donald Trump's record. Now Kamala Harris, she wanted to make sex crimes with minors a nonviolent offense, which means more of these sickos out on the streets of our country. Do we want that? Absolutely not. Kamala Harris wanted to defund the police. She said it on video. Do we want to defund the police? Kamala Harris wants to make it easier for soft-on-crime prosecutors to go after our law enforcement. Do we want that? So do we want Kamala Harris as the prosecutor-in-chief of this country? No, we want Donald J. Trump, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Now, as Kamala Harris was doing all those things, let's remember the record of Donald J. Trump. When Kenosha, Wisconsin, which I was at just a few days ago, Kenosha, Wisconsin was about to burn in a terrible riot. Donald Trump called the governor and affirmatively offered the help of federal officials to stop those riots and to save the city of Kenosha. Donald Trump believes that we ought to properly fund our law enforcement and make sure our police get the pay and the equipment that they need. Donald Trump believes that we ought to stop these soft-on-crime prosecutors. If the police bring in a bad guy, the prosecutors ought to throw him behind bars and keep him there. And most importantly, Donald Trump believes that we ought to make our law enforcement lives easier by closing down that southern border and getting the drug cartels out of our communities. Now, I have to say that Kamala Harris, given that she's so into soft on crime policy, she did select a good running mate in Tim Walz. They make quite a dynamic duo. If you remember the riots of summer of 2020 when $13 billion of damage was done to the city of Minneapolis, Tim Walz was the governor of Minnesota, and Tim Walz did everything he could to let those rioters burn down the biggest city in his state. And then Kamala Harris did everything she could to bail out the rioters out of prison, right? What a dynamic duo they make. A dynamic duo for people who don't like law enforcement, a dynamic duo for people who want to make our streets less safe. I happen to believe in a very common sense principle that we're going to back the blue and bring public safety back to Georgia and back to our country. Now, Tim Walz, I will say, I've been beating up on Tim Walz a little bit. You may have seen this, but you know, Tim Walz loves to go around and say that he carried a weapon in war. That's what Tim Walz says. And of course, all of the veterans out there will know that Tim Walz never carried a weapon in war. The closest he went to a war zone was Italy, which last time I checked was not a war zone. But in Tim Walz's defense, he did let those rioters burn down Minneapolis, so maybe we should give Tim Walz a little bit of credit. Maybe the combat zone he visited was Minneapolis when he was the governor of Minnesota. But let's hear now from a great leader in Georgia law enforcement, and I just want to make sure I get Ashley's name right here, but we have a great sheriff in Ashley Polk who has made this community safer. Thank you. And I know he already offered a few words, but Sheriff, if you would, come up and just say a few more words about why we got to back law enforcement. Here's Sheriff Ashley Polk. Give him a round of applause.
Now, he lies about everything, of course. He calls me weird, but then he lies about how his kids were conceived. Who does that? That's just the weirdest thing I've ever seen. He said he served in combat, but the closest Tim Walz ever came to combat is when he let rioters burn Minneapolis to the ground and did absolutely nothing to stop it. And I know we have got a lot of veterans out there. I served in the United States Marine Corps, and I did go to Iraq when my country asked me, and I'm proud of it. And I know a lot of veterans who take offense but there are a lot of veterans from across our military who don't like it when other people lie about their service for military gain, and that's exactly what Tim Walz did. It is a slap in the face to all veterans, and it's not just from Tim Walz. Kamala Harris not only chooses to stand by this man because in spite of his dishonesty, she actually chose him to become her vice president to begin with. Now, while we're on the subject of their convention, she said something else at her convention. She said, and I don't know if you paid attention here, she said there are going to be extremely serious consequences for voting for Donald Trump. Now, Kamala, I've got two responses to that. First of all, that is not a very presidential thing to say. Is she the vice president or the vice principal, warning about very serious consequences, whining at people for telling a joke instead of trying to persuade them that she deserves to be their president? I'm sick of people like that. But second, it's the substance, because the extremely serious consequences, Kamala, have come from your leadership as Vice President of the United States. Americans can't afford groceries because of your leadership, Kamala. Young people can't afford homes because of the policies that you have enacted as Vice President. Now, the only serious consequence in November that I'm worried about is giving Kamala Harris a disastrous promotion. Let's say to Kamala Harris, you are fired. We are not sending you to the Oval Office. Now, my favorite line from Kamala is she says, if you elect her president, she is going to fix it all on day one. Well, Kamala, I hate to break it to you, but day one was 1,300 days ago. You've been vice president for 3.5 years. What the hell have you been doing during all that time? The message from this crowd and this state of Michigan is you had your chance, you're failed, and we're not giving you a promotion. And Donald J. Trump is coming back to clean up your mess, Kamala Harris, and it's going to start right here in the state of Michigan. Now, while overwhelming America's firefighters and EMTs, Kamala Harris's open border policy, it's also depleting our budgets. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, not a fan of mine or President Trump, said that illegal immigration will destroy New York City due to the huge financial strain, which is about $12 billion over the next 3 years, and that's just in New York City. The mayor announced sweeping budget cuts that would slash $300 million from the fire department and cut the number of police officers to the lowest level since the 1990s. And it's the same story all over the United States of America. Illegal immigration cost Chicago taxpayers $361 million last year. Denver is shelling out $180 million. Washington, D.C. is paying $36 million. If we don't secure our border soon, my friends, our cities are going to have to cut vital police, fire, and emergency medical services to the bone. And it's you who's going to suffer, and it's the people you serve who are going to suffer. We shouldn't be forced to spend billions of dollars on people who aren't even supposed to be here. We should be spending that money on schools, police and fire departments, and our citizens. And under President Donald J. Trump's leadership, we will. Now, here's another promise, not just a promise based on some plan that's written on a website, but based on the real record. When Donald Trump is president, we won't sit on our hands while rioters and arsonists burn down American cities like they did to Minneapolis in 2020. Now, I'd ask you to remember the scene back in the summer of 2020, state troopers in full riot gear protecting the firefighters of Minneapolis from the rabid mob that was torching down that city. And we have to ask, why were they doing it? And part of the reason they were doing it is because people like Tim Walz invited those rioters into Minneapolis, and it was people like Donald Trump who were trying to send in the National Guard to protect them, to protect you. And we sure as hell will not bail out the criminals like Kamala Harris did. The criminals, many of whom were going after our firefighters as they tried to keep our cities safe and put out the fires. We're going to put criminals behind bars where they belong, and we will always stand with the courageous firefighters and the first responders who keep this country safe every single day.
So let's expand on one of those points, which I think is very important. And so Tim Walz signed a piece of legislation, and by the way, Washington, Oregon, and California have very similar laws, and these are called trans-sanctuary state laws, where effectively it is medical kidnapping, where if you have a 14-year-old son or daughter that declares that they are a boy when they are biologically a girl, or vice versa, that the state has the ability to take possession and custody of your minor if you as the parent do not affirm the new gender that they might have learned at school or on TikTok. Is that correct, JD?
That's exactly right. And that's kidnapping, Charlie. That is legalized kidnapping. And if you're a Christian or just a person of conscience in this country, you ought to be telling the person who wants to do that, no way. We are not letting you anywhere near the halls of power. And that's what we have an opportunity to do. But it is so sick. I mean, think about this. Look, Charlie, I have an incredible amount of sympathy and compassion for some of these kids. I mean, you know, adolescence is confusing for almost every teenager, right? Every teenager goes through this or that thing. They go through an awkward phase. They maybe go through a goth phase. That was big when I was a kid in the 90s. Look, kids go through this stuff. But now we have social media going and telling them that, hey, you know, it's not just growing up or it's not just growing pains. You are in the wrong body. And you need to go mutilate yourself to feel like a whole person again. That's a terribly scary thing for a young teenager to go through. Tim Walz wants to take those kids away from their parents. I think we ought to encourage the parents to make those kids safe and to help them deal with whatever they're dealing with, not steal them away from the people who love them the most. It's sick, but it's not just sick, Charlie. It reveals an entire value set. You ask yourself, how could you be the governor of a state. I mean, every protective instinct that I have as a father is if I'm in a position of leadership, I'm going to fight back against the people who are trying to burn down my city. Or I've got 3 little kids. I'm going to fight back against the people who are trying to take my children away from me because they got a weird idea in their head from social media. Or I'm going to fight back against the people who are stealing the jobs of American workers or making it unaffordable for young Americans to buy a home. Tim Walz, every single time he gets an opportunity, he fights for the people who are harming American citizens. We need a president who's going to fight for American citizens. We just don't have that right now in this country.
Amen. And just to expand on that, think about it. A kid goes through a phase and now is able to irreversibly damage him or herself without parental consent. There's a reason why you're not allowed to get a tattoo till you're 18 years old. Right. Because you might do something that you might regret. And yet now we call that gender-affirming care. Only President Trump and JD Vance stand for the children of this country against that horror that is happening to our children.
That's right.
So, expanding on that, JD, I see some of these signs out here, which is one of the 20 planks of the new Republican platform, which is no men in women's sports. It says it right there. Right there. JD, how did we get in a place where now this needs to be a policy position? And if Kamala Harris or Tim Walz took questions, maybe they'd have to answer for this. But they're okay with biological males competing in sports against females.
Yeah, which is, first of all, it's so unfair to the girls. Sometimes they've competed for their entire lives to reach the height of their particular sport. And then they have to, you've seen this in the swimming competitions or in the weightlifting competitions. They go up against a biological male who has advantages that are just so obvious, and it's insulting to these girls. But it's also dangerous for the girls. I mean, we of our 3 kids, we got 2 boys and a girl. I really don't want my 2-year-old to step into a competitive physical sport with a biological male because he might hurt her. And as a father, I believe that the job of fathers is to protect our daughters, not promote the people who are trying to harm them. And again, it just drives home how warped this value system is, right? Americans want very common sense things. They want their children to be able to afford to buy a home. They want good schools. They want safe streets. They want a closed border. Why are Kamala Harris and Tim Walz focused on forcing biological males to compete against our girls in sports? It's insane. And it's not just that, Charlie. So this came up in the state of Ohio, and when I first heard it, I didn't believe it. That the Harris administration was threatening local school districts. If they didn't go along with all of the gender and transgender craziness, they were going to take away free and reduced school lunch funding. That was the weapon. That was the weapon that they were using. If you want your free and reduced lunch funding, then you need to do what we want you to do on the transgender stuff. What kind of a human being would be willing to take food out of the mouths of poor children because the local school district doesn't buy into Kamala Harris's values? That is really sick, and we don't need to be led by people like that. We need to be led by people who support American values, who, when a local school district says, we don't want Kamala Harris's values in our school district, let's make it easier for them to live their values and easier for them to protect their children, not steal money from poor kids because we want to force something down their throat.
I love it. I want to get
their whole lives.
Which is a perfect segue to her running mate. Are you guys big Tim Walz fans here?
Neither am I.
By the way, I know what you're thinking. Are you not excited to see JD Vance debate Tim Walz? Is that not going to be one of the best things ever? They better have a mercy rule. Who's moderating that debate?
Nora O'Donnell from CBS. And I think what actually might happen based on his military service is he's going to bail out at the last minute but say he went anyway. I think that's the Tim Walz approach to the debate.
By his own admission, he says he's not a good debater. Okay. I don't know. I don't even know what to make of that. JD Vance is one of the best we have, by the way, as you could tell. But let's just look at the record, because not only has Kamala Harris stood for foreigners over Americans in every possible way, let's look at Tim Walz. Tim Walz, taxpayer-funded tuition for illegals in Minnesota. Correct me if I get any of this wrong.
That's right.
The driver's licenses for illegals. And also, I know there are other policies as well that were accommodating foreigners in the state of Minnesota. On top of that, there's so much there that needs to be explained, yet he does not take questions. And I want all of you to understand this. If you're an undecided voter watching this at home, because we have millions of people watching this, or if you're an undecided voter here tonight, the ticket that is willing on a daily basis to take questions from reporters is probably the ticket that should govern your country, not the one that runs away from reporters. And if I may editorialize just a little bit more, why are reporters and journalists continually providing cover for the side that won't talk to them? It's very bizarre. It's like, at some point, when will these reporters say, I'm not going to carry your water anymore because you won't even allow me to ask a question? By the way, how pathetic was that CNN interview with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz? The whole thing was very weird. So Tim Walz, with George Floyd, allowed Minneapolis to burn and did not call in the National Guard within 24 hours. Talk about Tim Walz, without a doubt, the most radical, out-of-touch vice presidential selection in modern American political history.
Yes, so much we could talk about, and I think it's important to reinforce this just drives home how terrible Kamala Harris's judgment is, right? Now, she says she doesn't want to defund the police, even though she supported those policies. Then she goes and picks a VP nominee who allowed rioters to burn Minneapolis to the ground and actually pushed back against Donald Trump when he said that he wanted to send in the National Guard to save Minneapolis. And thank God, eventually, Donald Trump did exactly that. Finally, Tim Walz relented, but after, of course, $13 billion damage had been done. This is a guy who, I was asked by John Carl of ABC, said, you've accused Tim Walz of wanting to kidnap people who don't want to consent to gender reassignment for their kids. And I said, well, he signed legislation, he supported legislation that would take children away from their parents if their parents don't want to do sex changes. How would you define that as anything other than kidnapping? And this is a guy, by the way, Charlie, who says that he believes in small government, that he wants the government to stay out of your bedroom. He wants the government to steal your children from you if you don't agree with Tim Walz's values. That is not small government. That's disgusting, and he should be ashamed of himself. Yeah. But look, But the most fundamental issue, and we're going to keep on going back to it, Charlie, is you cannot stand for working people. He says that he's a union guy, that he supports union people, that he supports working people. You can't stand for working people if you're trying to import millions of illegal aliens to steal their jobs. There is no way that you can square that circle. The biggest threat to American workers in this country, the biggest threat to Americans being able to afford a home is when Kamala Harris has let 25 million illegal aliens just set up shop in this country. So Tim Walz doesn't stand for workers. He stands for the Democrat Party donors, and that's exactly who's going to serve as vice president. We're going to serve the people. That's who Donald J. Trump and I believe we ought to serve and we ought to fight for.
So let's expand on one of those points, which I think is very important.
Next question. Well, first of all, I'd love to have a second debate. We've actually offered Tim Walz a second debate, and they've totally rejected it. But look, I actually think that you should have to earn this job. Like, think about this. I'm asking all of you and everybody watching on TV, the whole country, to do something that really should put a person in awe. I'm asking you to make me the Vice President of the United States. And to do that, that is an awesome and frankly a very humbling thing. But the only way to go and do that is to earn people's vote, not to hide from them in a basement, which is what Kamala Harris is doing. I cannot imagine running the campaign that she's run. She wants to be the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world, and she hides from the people that she wants to lead. I think it's disgraceful. Me and Donald Trump, we get out there as much as possible. We talk to everybody we possibly can because we respect the American people enough to earn their vote.
look, I'm looking forward to the debate. I'm sure Governor Walz is looking forward to the debate, but maybe not. But look, we're going to get out there and we're going to talk to the American people about policy. What do I want to talk about? I want to talk about how can Kamala Harris run away from her record. She pretends that she's been nowhere near the White House for the last 3.5 years. She's the sitting vice president of the United States. She says that she wants to do a lot of things on day one. She's the sitting vice president of the United States. And I happen to think that, we should think of an election like a job interview. A person who refuses to do interviews and a person who refuses to acknowledge her own failures and a person who refuses to run on her record, we're not going to give that person a promotion. We're going to get her out of Washington, send her back to San Francisco where she belongs. And I hate to say it, we're running short on time, but I'll do one more question and leave you with a final thought, and then we'll have to hit the road. But one more question. Next question.
Yes. Hello and welcome to Traverse City. We're glad to have you here.
It's good to be here.
I'm Jennifer Isbell with Michigan News Source, and my question is, what are you doing to prepare for the upcoming difficult debate against your opponent?
Well, look, I think the way I see the debate is very simple. It's an opportunity where for 90 minutes, Governor Walz and I are going to debate the issues that matter to the American people. And what I'm going to try to show is very simple, that the candidacy, the team of substance, the team that actually has a record that we're proud of instead of we're running away from, and the team that actually has a plan is the team of Trump-Vance. And that's what I'm going to try to do is, look, I think one of the fundamental differences between Kamala Harris's campaign and Donald Trump's campaign is we speak to our fellow Americans like they're citizens, because they are. Kamala Harris speaks to her fellow Americans like they're children. And so what I'm just going to try to talk about here is explicitly what we're going to do to make your life better. And here are the ways in which the current administration has made your life worse. And we're going to try to connect it to public policy, because that's what I think the American people care about. So that's my plan. So we're studying up as much as we can on the issues that matter to the American people. And I'm looking forward to it because, again, as much as the moderators may very well be biased, we'll see about that. I know they were the first time. But it's an opportunity for me to get to tell the American people how I think we can make their lives better, and how Donald Trump's policies can make them more prosperous, can make the world more peaceful, and can secure that southern border. If we do those things, we're going to win, and I believe we will. Next question. We'll just do a couple more here.
Well, it is great to be in the great state of Michigan once again. It is great to be at an incredible manufacturing firm, Visioneering, and it is great to be in the state that I think is going to be pivotal to giving us 270 electoral votes and making Donald Trump the next president of the United States. Now, it's hard to believe, but we've only got 33 days until the election. Now, that's a good news, bad news situation, because that means we've got a very limited amount of time to make our case to the American people that Donald Trump ought to be reelected president. But the good news is that means only 33 more days for Kamala Harris to gaslight and lie to the American people, and that's a pretty good thing. Now, we of course had a debate last night, a vice presidential debate. I thought it went pretty well. Now, it's funny because, we did this debate, and then I talked to the president afterwards, and we talked a little bit about, what actually happened, and, some of the points that I made, some of the points that Governor Walz made. And, he made this observation. He said that Tim Walz said that he was friends with school shooters twice. And that's something I actually didn't notice, that Tim Walz had said that on the debate stage. And I said, did he really say that, sir? And he said, I'm telling you, man, go and watch the clips. He said he was friends with school shooters twice. And I said that was probably only the third or fourth dumbest comment Tim Walz made that night then. Because look, I got to be honest, I feel a little bad for Governor Walz. And the reason I feel bad for him is because he has to defend the indefensible, and that is the record of Kamala Harris. And think about goods cheaper somehow. Well, we've been living through the inflation of the last 3.5 years, and we know that when we make our country less self-reliant, when we pursue the policies that Kamala Harris says that we ought to pursue, it makes Americans poorer. It drives up the cost of food and of housing. It makes our country less prosperous, and it makes our nation more dependent on people who don't like us to make the critical stuff that we need. We got to get rid of that. Stop listening to the economists and start listening to common sense in this country. But think about this. They said, here's the deal. Tim Walz has the audacity, and Kamala Harris has the audacity to say that, well, if Donald Trump's policies are enacted, that's going to lead to higher prices for American consumers. Tim, we already ran this experiment once. Donald Trump's economic policies worked for American families. They worked for American consumers. But here's the thing. Think about this. If a Chinese company wants to hire a literal slave laborer making $4 a day, and they want to import the goods made by that slave laborer, then it's going to make Americans poor. Because, of course, we shouldn't expect American middle-class workers to work for a slave wage in China. We ought to expect our middle-class workers to be able to support a family on those wages, and that's what we're going to fight for every single day. So here's what you got to do. To prevent those companies and those countries from undercutting the wages of American workers, you got to be willing to impose tariffs. Fight back against the theft of the American middle class. Penalize those companies that are shipping jobs overseas and give a tax cut to American workers. That's how you build prosperity for this country, and that's what we're going to fight for. And let's just recap what Kamala Harris's policies have actually done. The average Michigan family is spending over $1,000 per month to pay for what they could have bought 3.5 years ago. That's $12,000 a year, a hidden tax of $12,000 a year just to be able to buy what you could have bought 3.5 years ago. That's not pro-working people. Kamala Harris has presided over policies that have seen the cost of housing go up by over 50%. That is not pro-working families. She's seen policies that have seen the cost of eggs go up by more than double. Gallon of milk is now about $4 in the state of Michigan. Groceries are up 25%. Kamala Harris's leadership has been tried, and it has been found wanting, and Americans, we want to get back to common sense. We want to be able to afford a nice living, a nice house for our families, and to do that, we have got to elect the common sense leadership of Donald J. Trump, and that's exactly what everybody in this room is going to do. Now I want to talk about just something else that, you know, credit card delinquencies are about 9% right now. That means a lot of American families are sacrificing. They're not paying their credit card debts so they can afford groceries or they can afford the mortgage. What a disgrace and what a sad commentary it is on Kamala Harris's economic policies that you've got hardworking people who are doing everything that they can to provide for their families, and they're falling further behind. Not because they're not doing their job, but because Kamala Harris isn't doing hers. So, and ma'am, you're right. Kamala Harris doesn't care about this because she doesn't understand, because she doesn't talk to anybody. She's afraid of interviews, so she doesn't talk to people, and she doesn't realize that her economic policies are making it harder on American families. And you all know my story. I talked about it a little bit last night. But I was raised by a grandmother who sometimes would refuse to turn on the heating at night when times got especially tough. I was raised by a woman who would sometimes forego paying for her own medicines so that she could put food on the table in our family. And I remember feeling, even though money was tight, that thanks to my grandmother, I never really lacked for anything. But American grandparents and American parents shouldn't have to make those sacrifices to begin with. If you work hard and play by the rules, you ought to be able to afford a good life for your family. And that's what Donald Trump and I are going to fight for every single day for the next.
And Donald Trump and I are ready to lead a great American manufacturing renaissance. We're going to make more in America. We're going to do it with the hands of Michigan workers. Now, I don't know if you saw yesterday, but we had a pretty fun debate in New York City. Did you guys watch the debate? We had a little fun. Now, I have to confess, though, I feel a little bit of sympathy. I feel bad for Governor Tim Walz. Some of you clearly don't. But here's what I said to the governor last night is he has got actually the toughest job in American politics. And in some ways, I've got the easiest job in American politics. Because all I've got to do is remind the American people that just 4 short years ago, we had rising take-home pay, we had lower inflation, we had a secure border, and we had it thanks to the leadership of Donald J. Trump. That's an easy message to get out there to the American people. Now, Governor Walz, by contrast, think about it. He's got to get out there every single day and try to convince people that Kamala Harris, who has caused the problems that we see in this country for the last 3.5 years, is somehow going to do something different than what she's done over the last 3 years. That's a tough job. You know, I never worked in sales myself, but it's always good when you work in sales to have a good product to sell. And unfortunately for Tim Walz, he has got the crappiest product to sell in the entire United States of America. Because let's just recap this. Kamala Harris cast the deciding vote on trillions of dollars of spending that we couldn't afford, printing money that we didn't have, and driving the cost of inflation through the roof. That was thanks to Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris went to war on the American energy industry, driving the cost of fuel and gas and everything else through the roof. Kamala Harris was the border czar. Don't let the media lie to you. They bragged about her being the border czar for 3 years during the worst open border in the history of the United States of America. And Kamala Harris, by Joe Biden's own admission, was the last person in the room during some of the most disastrous foreign policy decisions in the history of this country. So we ought to feel a little bit bad for Governor Tim Walz, and we ought to feel a little bit grateful to Donald Trump for giving us great leadership, because we've got a hell of a product to sell. It's peace and prosperity, and we're going to bring it back to the American people. Now, some of you may have seen that I had a little debate with Governor Walz a few days ago. And I have to admit, I'm maybe the only person in Butler, Pennsylvania that feels that way, but I feel a little bad for Tim Walz, if I'm being honest with you. Because Tim Walz has to defend the indefensible. He has to act like Kamala is going to drive down inflation, bring up wages and bring back jobs and restore peace, the very peace that she destroyed. Well, I hate to break it to you, Tim, but everyone knows the truth. Kamala caused every single one of those problems because Kamala's day one in the White House was 1,400 days ago. Never let her lie to you and pretend that she's going to do something great. She's been in power for 3.5 years and she hasn't done a damn thing.
We'll take a few questions, ma'am.
Senator Vance, in 1984, your papa is the first and only time he voted for Republicans, saying he didn't really care for Reagan, but he couldn't stand that son of a B. Mondale. What do you think 40 years later he'd say about Walz's leadership?
I think my grandfather would say it's disgraceful to have a person whose job is to defend people, is to defend the least among us, who lets rioters and looters burn down this precinct and threaten the lives of our law enforcement. I think my grandfather believed that he believed in the basic American idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you ought to be able to live a good life. If you violate the law and commit violence against your fellow citizens, you ought to be thrown in jail. That's common sense, I think, to 90% of our country, and unfortunately, we have a president and a vice president who really don't believe in that basic common sense principle. Because of it, violent crime is way too high in this country. Violent crime is way too high in this country.
So on June 1, 2020, Trump was on a call with governors, and he praised Walz, calling him an excellent guy, saying that he fully agreed with how he handled it after he activated the guard entirely. Does he still stand by that praise?
Well, look, I think President Trump, during a conference call, said something nice and polite about Governor Walz. The record is the record. Donald Trump, of course, can be polite to Governor Walz. I was polite to Governor Walz during my debate. It doesn't mean that he should have let rioters and looters burn down the city of Minneapolis. And the more that we learn, the more that I talk to law enforcement officers, I cannot believe how much this governor abandoned his own people. The very quality of leadership is that you fight for your own people, you keep them safe, you try to protect them. He abandoned these officers at their moment of most critical need. That complete lack of leadership is what he's going to bring to the vice presidency if the American people elect him. It's why I hope that they don't.
What did Donald Trump... There's a difference, though, between saying something nice and saying you fully agree with how he handled it. Are you saying Donald Trump wasn't sincere when he said he fully agreed with how the governor handled the situation?
What I'm saying is that Donald Trump was being polite during a conference call, and that doesn't mean that Tim Walz can run away from the fact that he let his own city burn to the ground.
Now, I got to say, I've come to actually feel a little sorry for my Democratic colleague Tim Walz, who's running with Kamala Harris. No. Think about it. Think about it. I've got the easiest job in American politics, and he's got the hardest job in American politics. Tim Walz has to try to convince the American people that Kamala Harris hasn't been vice president for the last 3.5 years. Tim Walz has got to try to convince people that Kamala Harris didn't cast trillions of dollars in new spending, which shot inflation through the roof and made groceries unaffordable for American citizens. Tim Walz has got to convince the American people that Kamala Harris actually knows what she wants to do as President of the United States, and I just don't think anybody's buying it. Now, I, on the other hand, have the easiest job because I just have to remind people that when Donald Trump was president, inflation was 1.5%. Pretty good. I just have to remind people that when Donald Trump was president, take-home pay was rising faster than it had in 40 years in the United States of America. And I just have to remind people that when Donald Trump was president, the southern border was secure and America was safe. And thank God for that. So I know all of you are praying for me, and I know we got a lot of Catholics for Trump. I see the signs here. Thank you, Catholics for Trump. And we got a lot of non-Catholics as well. And I just wanted to say, I know you're praying for me, and I really do appreciate it. I need those prayers every single day. But maybe spare a prayer for Tim Walz, because he's got to defend Kamala Harris, and that's the toughest job in American politics. Now, I'm going to maybe surprise a little bit of the folks in this arena, because I'm going to be a little bipartisan here. I'm going to talk about Governor Tim Walz, and I got to be honest with you, I feel bad for him. No. We ought to spare a prayer for Governor Tim Walz, because he's got the hardest job in American politics. He's got to convince the American... What's up, man? You all can say that. I probably shouldn't say that. But think about our friend Tim Walz has got to convince the American people that Kamala Harris is going to somehow fix the very problems she's been creating over the last 3.5 years. He's got to pretend that Kamala Harris didn't open up the southern border and let millions of illegal aliens in, even though we know she did. He's got to pretend what the news of the day is, and I saw that I guess Governor Tim Walz did a live stream of a Madden football game, professional football game. Obviously not playing; they were playing video games, and he did it with AOC. And I guess the goal is to try to appeal to the young male vote by playing video games online with AOC. And I don't know who came up with that idea, but I guess afterwards, you know, because Tim Walz and Kamala Harris, they always like to talk about Project 2025, and you know, which by the way is a complete dishonest disgrace. Project 2025 has nothing to do with the Trump campaign, and it never has. But set that to the side. He was talking about playbooks and trying to connect that to Project 2025, and he said, you know, yesterday AOC, she did very good. She ran a pick six. I think, like, you know, you don't run a pick six. You run the West Coast offense or the spread offense, or the 3-4, the 4-3. Like, it made me realize that I think that even though they say Tim Walz was a college football coach, that I think I know more about football than Tim Walz. And it's appropriate because I think my running mate, Donald J. Trump, knows more about working at McDonald's than Kamala Harris does. Now, I was told, actually, right before I came on the stage that I guess Governor Tim Walz was here just a few days ago. And they had, apparently they thought he was going to have 300 people, but he only had 200. That's too bad for Tim. But now we're here and we've got 1,000 people, so I'd say all the joy is with the Trump campaign. Now, why, of course, we ought to ask ourselves, why is the joy with the Trump campaign? And I think there's a couple things that we have that they don't. First of all, I'm actually proud of my running mate's record, and Tim Walz is ashamed of his running mate's record. That's one big difference. But I figured out, I think that the thing that we're allowed to do on the Trump campaign that they wish they could do on the Harris-Walz campaign is just tell the truth to the American people. And, you know, there are all these little ways in which I think the dishonesty of the Kamala Harris campaign comes out, and some big ways too. But, you know, my favorite is I was reading a little bit about the news this morning, and I saw that Governor Tim Walz, they're going to appeal to the young men vote in the United States of America by playing Madden on the internet with AOC. That's their new strategy. They did that yesterday, and they did it, of course, during, you know, when most normal people were watching real football, not watching Madden online with AOC and Tim Walz. But he also, I guess, took to social media and said that AOC was really good because she ran a good pick six. And I'm like, you know, I'm a casual football fan. I paid attention to the NFL and college football for most of my life, and I don't know what it means to run a pick six. You know, you would, for the football fans in the audience, you know, you would like run a spread offense or you'd run a West Coast offense. You don't run a pick six. A pick six is something that happens on the field. And this guy's supposed to be a football coach, and I thought to myself, maybe I actually know more about football than Governor Tim Walz. And it's appropriate because I think that Donald Trump knows more about working at McDonald's than Kamala Harris. So you know, I was thinking that I actually feel bad for Governor Tim Walz in Minnesota, and I'm probably the only person in this room who feels bad for Tim Walz because he's actually got, in a lot of ways, the hardest job in American politics. He's got to go around the country and try to pretend that Kamala Harris is fit to serve as president of these United States. And you know, you think about it, what Governor Tim Walz has to do, and we should, you know, I know we've got a lot of church-going folks in this room, and we love you. We're thrilled to have you. We ought to spare a prayer for Governor Tim Walz, because think about it. This guy's got to go around and pretend that Kamala Harris isn't the cause of the inflation and the affordability crisis affecting American families. He's got to go around and pretend that even though Kamala Harris said she was going to open the border, he's got to pretend that she somehow cares about border security. And he's got to pretend that the vice president who presided over the most chaotic situation in the world is somehow going to be a president of peace and prosperity. He's also got to pretend that Kamala Harris actually has ideas for how to govern the United States of America. I've actually got, in a lot of ways, I've got the easiest job in American politics, because all that I have to do is remind people that Donald J. Trump was the president of peace and the president of prosperity. I get to remind people that when Donald J. Trump was president, inflation was at 1.5%. That's pretty good. I get to remind people that when Donald Trump was president, we had the fastest rising take-home pay in a generation in the United States of America. And I get to remind the American people that when Donald J. Trump was president, the border was secure and our country was safe. Now, the thing about Kamala Harris, and I will, you didn't expect me to be bipartisan today, but here I am saying something nice about Governor Tim Walz and something nice about Kamala Harris. The thing that she does have going for her is that every time she does an interview, I think that we gain about 100,000 votes for the Trump ticket. And the reason is because Kamala, when she doesn't have a teleprompter in front of her, she actually sometimes, by mistake, will tell the truth. Because the entire narrative of Kamala Harris's campaign is that she has nothing to do with the policies of Joe Biden, even though she's the sitting vice president of the United States. The narrative of the Kamala campaign is that she had nothing to do with the rising inflation, even though she cast the deciding vote on trillions of dollars of new spending. Even though Kamala Harris came into office bragging that she was going to undo Donald Trump's border policies, she has got to somehow convince the American people that she had nothing to do with it, even though there's clips of her on TV saying that she wanted to undo Donald Trump's border policies. So that's the truth about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is more of the same, more of the broken border policies, more of the unaffordable groceries and unaffordable housing, more of the broken leadership. And I think that we ought to say to Kamala Harris, you are fired. Go back to San Francisco where you belong. We want a real president.
But look, it's very simple here. We are done with early vote, which means that tomorrow is our last chance. Tomorrow is the last day. Tomorrow is the big day when we are going to vote in very big numbers in the state of Wisconsin. We're going to vote for change. We're going to vote for American prosperity. We're going to vote for Donald J. Trump to be the President of the United States. And the Secret Service told me that, I guess Tim Walz is going to be here in the state of Wisconsin. I'm sorry about that. I know we're close to Minnesota, so you guys know Governor Tim Walz well. But here's what I want to say. I know a lot of you, like me, are praying people of faith, and I want you to spare a prayer for Governor Tim Walz, because if you think about this, I know all of us have had hard days at work. Your back hurts, your hands are tired, but I don't think any of us have ever had the kind of day that Tim Walz is going to have today, where he's got to go around and convince the American people that Kamala Harris can be the President of the United States. That's tough work. That is a tough job, my friends. I think that's the toughest job in the United States of America, because think about it. As much as Kamala Harris pretends that she's something that she's not, and as much as Kamala Harris runs away from Joe Biden, you would think that Kamala doesn't even know who Joe Biden is, even though she's his vice president. Kamala Harris, we know, she's more of the same. Kamala Harris is more of the same high grocery prices. Kamala Harris is more of the same unaffordable housing. Kamala Harris is more of the same chaos around the world. And Kamala Harris is more of the same wide open border. So tomorrow, Wisconsin, let's vote for a new direction for this country. Let's vote for Donald J. Trump to be the President of the United States.
Look, I got to be honest with you. I saw Tim Walz a couple days ago in Las Vegas, Nevada. We were both arriving in beautiful Las Vegas airport at the exact same time. And, you know, I actually feel bad for Governor Tim Walz, if I'm being honest with you, because think about this. He's got the toughest job in American politics. You know, maybe one of the toughest jobs in America, period. He's got to go around the United States of America and pretend that Kamala Harris is fit to be president of the United States. And I know, look, think about it. I know a lot of us have had hard days at work. Our hands hurt, our backs are tired, but have you ever had the kind of day where you had to tell people that Kamala Harris was able to be the president of the United States? That's tough work, my friends. But here's the thing, you know, we don't have to guess at what Kamala Harris's leadership is going to be like. We don't have to pretend that the slogans and what she says with a teleprompter in front of her is the reality. We know exactly what Kamala Harris is going to do because she's already been doing it for the last 4 years. And what is the consequence of Kamala Harris's leadership? What does Tim Walz have to go around America and pretend that Kamala Harris has been doing? Well, we know that thanks to Kamala Harris and trillions of dollars of new spending, our fellow citizens can't afford to buy groceries, that gas prices are up by 45%. Did you see the jobs report that came out just a couple of days ago? 28,000 private sector jobs that we lost. 46,000 American manufacturing jobs lost in the United States of America. But you know the only category where we gained employment was the government. So under Kamala Harris's economy, our good, hardworking Michigan citizens, they're losing their jobs. Our great Michigan auto workers are losing their jobs, but Kamala Harris's government bureaucrats are doing just fine. And look, I don't wish unemployment on anybody. I know it's terribly stressful to lose a job, but the one person that I think that we're going to make unemployed tomorrow is Kamala Harris, because we don't want her anywhere near the Oval Office. So say a prayer if you're a praying type. Say a prayer for Tim Walz because he's got the toughest job in American politics. And meanwhile, I've got the easiest job in American politics. Because think about this. I don't just have to tell you about Donald Trump's plans, even though we've got a lot of great plans. I just have to talk about the record of Donald J. Trump in office. When Donald Trump was in office, inflation was at 1.5%. The dollar went as far as it's ever gone in the United States of America. When Donald J. Trump was president, wages were rising faster than they had in 40 years in the United States of America. And when Donald J. Trump was president, the border was secure and the Mexican drug cartels were on the run. That's a hell of a record to run on. So I've got the easiest job. I've just got to try to convince our fellow citizens all over the state of Michigan, all over the United States of America, that if we get back to the common sense policies of Donald J. Trump, we can get back to the peace and prosperity of that leadership. And I do believe, my friends, that we are on the cusp of a golden age of American prosperity. We're on the cusp of an America where we're not just energy independent, but we're energy dominant. We're on the cusp. We're ready to make the American dream of homeownership affordable for millions of young Americans all over the state of Michigan and all over America. But the thing that we've got to do, the only thing that we can do to unleash that golden age of American prosperity, is to get Donald J. Trump back in the White House. So let's go and do it, and let's do it together.